All right, then. I'm going to go ahead and start, and the number is at 56, 57. So I know, again, that number will change through the day, but that's still a very healthy number, and we welcome you, and we're delighted to have you here. I have a note to myself to say, good X, participants to insert their relevant part of the day. And so that's good morning from Southern California. And it is my job to speak first to welcome you to the inaugural TIPCEEE. And yes, we caught what that means. But what it really means is topics in prebiotic chemistry in early Earth environments. Probably a lot of you won't know who I am. I don't travel in the early Earth origin of life community, well, early Earth, but usually not Hadean. But I've inserted myself increasingly into this domain with great pleasure. And my paying job is that I'm a professor of biogeochemistry at UC Riverside. And I again have been entrusted with the honor of, on behalf of the co-leads of PCE3, Prebiotic Chemistry in Early Earth Environments, and NASA Research Coordination Network, I've been entrusted and honored to invite you to this inaugural TIPCEEE. And those co-leads are Karen Rogers, Ram Krishnamurti, and Lauren Williams. I also have the pleasure of eventually, soon, turning the microphone over to Eve Berger, who will introduce you to her team of organizers who put together this actual first TIPCEEE. And it is also my opportunity on behalf of Ram and Karen and Lauren and the global community to thank them for working so hard on this. It wasn't easy to do the first one. We were in the process of putting this together, also laying down the framework that will make each subsequent TIPCEEE easier. That's the hope, the goal anyway. And then I think most importantly to thank Teresa Kane, who is sitting to my left, who is project coordinator, so many different things. And one of the myriad hats that she wears is helping to make sure that our RCN goes forward and that specific tasks within that are handled with great aplomb. And that is clearly the case every day. So thank you, Teresa. She's blushing over there. Some of you will be somewhat new, maybe, to the NASA framework of research coordination networks. And even if you're not, it's nice to hear every once in a while someone else's take on what they are. The RCNs, Research Coordination Networks, are 5 in number. And the very brief version of the history is that when the NASA Astrobiology Institute was founded in 1998, it had a terrific 20-year run. And there was a lot of revisitation about what it accomplished, which was a lot, and things that might be done differently 20 years later within a world of new ways of doing coordinated science. And so that spawned the notion of the research coordination networks. And I should make very clear, because this question is asked all the time, the NAI was a funding arm. You could apply to be a fund receiving member of the NASA Astrobiology Institute. The RCNs are not. Membership as a part of the steering committee officially involves having a grant from NASA from a number of different programs. That includes the ICAR program, the Interdisciplinary Consortium in Astrobiological Research, but it doesn't require a massive grant. It can be a single PI exobiology, and there are many, many gateways to the steering committee. But what we like to emphasize always, 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 purposely said 3 times, is that the primary purpose of the RCNs is inclusion. And that goes far beyond those who are eating, partly through the graces of receiving a NASA award. It means people who are interested in the topic. That's really the only gateway. And ideally, that interest manifests in a willingness to invest some time, because participation in RCN activities is not precluded by not being a member of a steering committee or having a grant at all with NASA. And so let me just very quickly remind you of what the 5 RCNs are, and I'm not going to go through any details on this. You can go to the website, which has many of those details. The first one was was and is devoted to exoplanetary science. It's called Nexus, the Nexus for Exoplanetary System Science. And you can read the description. It is dedicated to the study of planetary habitability with a very strong focus, because it's under the umbrella of astrobiology, of the search for biosignatures along with habitability. The next one is called NFOLDS, which is the Network for Life Detection. The goal of NFOLD is to promote communication, coordination, and a synergy among researchers in the fields relevant to life detection. So in some ways, I think of it as the biosignature RCN, but that probably sells it short. It has a much broader array of goals, and biosignatures are part of the framework of how they view life broadly and habitability broadly. And so you can see that there's synergism with Nexus already, but NFOLDS casts a broader net, and there are many people in that group, for example, that are focused on Mars, but you need not be. So again, inclusion. There are really no gateways that you have to have a ticket for to get into this world. Now is the Network for Ocean Worlds. The Network for Ocean Worlds, otherwise known as NOW, seeks to advance comparative studies to characterize Earth and other ocean worlds across their interiors, oceans, and cryospheres. Of course, this is a hot topic, given interest in Europa and Enceladus and other wet places. The next one is LIFE, Early Cells to Multicellularity. LIFE is a research coordination network dedicated to understanding life from early cells to multicellularity. So in some ways, it sort of picks up where PCE3 leaves off. We focus primarily on how life began, and we do so, and this is really the bread and butter of our RCN. We view origin of life scenarios within a framework of what the early Earth was like at that time. So there's a very strong environmental context. There have been tremendous advances over the last 20 years that speak to the presence of oceans and the chemistry of those oceans, pH conditions, for example, the likelihood of plate tectonics operating, the likelihood of land masses, continents of some sorts, and whether they were emergent above the ocean level, the nature of impacts, the consequences of those impacts, hence this RCN. And so you can imagine, you all do this for a living, the many different environmental parameters that you control for in your experiments, or you think about in your thought experiments, or what have you. And so this RCN, I think, wasn't my idea, but I've been there from the beginning. I think it was cleverly designed around the idea of trying to bridge geology and biochemistry, constraints of what the environment allows, as much as we know it, and what we need to make these various models work. So it is not model specific. We're not attached to any particular view of how life begins, but we do try to, in a universal sense, speak to environmental parameters that affect all models. And so I, again, encourage you to go ahead and look at the website to get more information on that, and to write any of the co-leads among the different RCNs or NASA officials. There are many different pathways to getting information on this important, and I think increasingly successful scheme for how to do astrobiology in a very coordinated and inclusive way. So as we sat, and our group of co-leads meets every week, as we sat and talked about science for a good part of each meeting, which is one of the great luxuries, and it's been one of the highlights of my week to get together with these smart people and talk about things. One of the themes that became very common amongst our discussions was the nature of impacts early in Earth history and what role they may play. And I should tell you, my backdrop is that I work in many much younger stories about Earth history and the coevolution of life and environments. And so in my Phanerozoic world, impacts are primarily viewed as having deleterious effects, and we can think most famously of a driver of extinction. I think that's probably an overstatement even for the Phanerozoic, and some of you would probably love to discuss that for those younger times. But what emerged in our conversations is that there were many things, and I literally started a list that got longer and longer and longer, about how impacts may have played central roles in so many different ways in facilitating the early beginnings of prebiotic chemistry and the assembly of more complex molecules, and ultimately the emergence of life. And one of the amazing things for me is that many of these different components, whether it's redox in the atmosphere, the importance of land masses that are emergent, many of these different components that tie to impacts are not specific to any particular model. Many of them cross over to all the models, or at least to many of them. And so that was good. We're not trying to put filters in early in conversations. So this is again the inaugural workshop. We encourage you in the spirit of inclusion to come away from this with a lot of ideas about impacts and how they may have played a role in what you're thinking about. But what we really, really hope you'll do also is think long and hard about having your own TIPCEEE. And so it would take very little to write us and say, I loved doing that. And I would really like to put together one on X, and you can fill in your own X for that. And we would say, okay. And we can talk you through what's involved. And there are documents that have been prepared that we can steer you towards that are basically the template that was assembled initially with the concept of a TIPCEEE, and more specifically with the implementation of this TIPCEEE. It builds on our first workshop that was bigger, but this carries through many of the concepts that were developed then. That is looking at the talks before you come to this synchronous meeting for the conversations, and doing it virtually, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that, again, was such a success that we cherry picked the very best aspects of it and made it virtual lecture light, but not light in content, just light in duration. And so, again, I'll close by saying thank you so much for coming. And I will now turn over the microphone to the people who have really done all the heavy lifting and putting together this specific TIPCEEE. So Eve, take it away.
Thanks, Tim. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially all of our speakers and panel members. So Tim gave a great background of how we got here. I'm just going to walk you through sort of the phase space that we're talking about today, that hopefully you will recognize some of these concepts from the talks that you've listened to, and they will help us have a great conversation for each discussion. And so I like to talk with my hands, so apologies. You can turn me off if you don't want to see that. But I want you to imagine that you're a dust grain in the very early solar system, and you've accreted some ice on yourself, maybe water ice, maybe other volatiles, and you're a small particle. And maybe you remain a small particle throughout your entire lifetime as you float through space until you eventually land on a larger body. But maybe you get accreted by something larger. And that mass, as it's circling the solar system and orbiting around, it creates more mass each time as it's going. And maybe as a small ice and dust grain particle that's been accreted, you get modified while you're on that body in transient pockets of liquid that form from radioactive decay, the heat from the radioactive decay. And meanwhile, you may be modified. Your parent body's orbit is also going to be modified as it encounters larger objects and is affected by gravitational forces. And eventually, for the purpose of this workshop, you have a terminal encounter with the Earth. And what happens to you when you encounter the Earth depends on a lot of things. It depends on where we are in Earth's history. Are we oceans? Are we land masses? Are you a hypervelocity impact? Are you just a glancing blow across the surface? Or are you infall of one of more than 3,000 tons or 30,000 tons of interplanetary dust particles that hit the Earth every year? And then once you're on the surface, what happens to you? Do your volatiles get dispersed into the atmosphere? Are they partitioned into the mantle and the crust and the core? And how do plate tectonics and topography affect your ever-changing fate? And so you can think about, you formed, you get altered, you get delivered, you're altered again, you're altered again. All of these chemical and geological processes are going to affect how you contribute to prebiotic chemistry on the early Earth. And so how do we study this? We do sample characterization, which is what I do. We look at terrestrial and extraterrestrial materials. We do experimental simulations in the lab to study the effects of impacts on meteoritic analog materials. We model and simulate early Earth processes. We have people who go in the field and look at craters on Earth. And I wish someone very early in my career had steered me in that direction, because those look like the best field trips ever. As a chemist, I envy the geologists. We also do mission work to look at craters on other bodies, using orbital measurements, or using rovers to actually go into craters. We can use those as analog studies for the early Earth. We also have folks that do computational studies to look at processes across the histories of impactors, both prebiotic components and host materials. And so all of this and more, I know I didn't capture everyone's work, but to tease out what happened on the early Earth, a really wide array of expertise factors in. And I hope that as you listen to the talks that were submitted by our panel members, that you were inspired to think a little bit beyond the areas in which you currently do research. And I know you all received a set of questions that we were thinking about as we were putting this workshop together. But I'm hoping that there was something in one of those talks or more that sparked a new connection for you that feeds into your research. And as Tim asked at one of our meetings, if this were a proposal incubator, what new opportunities do you see? And with that, I'm going to ask the speakers in our first discussion session to come onto camera and take a minute. I'll introduce each of you, and I'd like you to take a minute to just give us the main takeaways from your messages. And so Catherine and Raj, Jamie, Matt, and Stephen, we're going to put you down here. And then also Jesse, if y'all could come on camera, that would be great. And Zoom is not working for me very well. Okay, great. So I'm going to just go in the order that we have the talks listed on the schedule. So we're going to start with Catherine, and I'm just going to do a little shout out because I am from Rutgers. It's my alma mater for undergrad, and yay, Rutgers. Okay, Catherine, take it away, please, and give us a brief intro.
Thank you, Eve, and thank you for having me join this. It's really a great opportunity. So my name is Catherine Birmingham. I'm a professor at Rutgers University. I'm an isotope cosmogeochemist. So I take isotopes and try and use them to piece together the building blocks of our planet. My talk focused on how siderophile elements like molybdenum, iron-loving elements and their isotopes, can be used to trace the timing of volatile element delivery to Earth. Volatile is key for life. So I went through how prior work has talked about the moon forming event providing a lot of these volatiles, but with some new method development from our group and some new data, we're seeing that maybe that's not quite the case, and the moon forming event didn't bring that much water and volatile to Earth. Perhaps it's later, perhaps it's earlier, and I'd love to discuss that. So thank you.
Thank you. Raj.
Hi, this is Raj Dasgupta from Rice University, Houston, Texas. In my talk, I guess I focused on the concept of delivery of life essential volatile elements, primarily carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and water to the growing earth. And the main concepts I wanted to kind of get across is when we think about building a proto-earth and then the final body of the earth, it's not necessarily only through undifferentiated chondritic meteorites. It's potentially by accretion of both differentiated and undifferentiated bodies. And when you think about that process of growth of Earth through different types of asteroidal bodies, some are differentiated, some are undifferentiated, you need to be thinking about processing of these volatile elements in the parent bodies or the planetesimals that contribute towards the growth of the Earth. And interestingly, the elements we are interested for life or for making atmospheres, we call them volatile elements because they are concentrated in the atmosphere. However, many of them are also sometimes potentially siderophile elements like carbon, nitrogen, sulfur. They can be siderophile, so they can partition into the core. So one of the things I tried to summarize is from the experimental geochemistry or petrology community, what has been some of the focus over the last 10 years in terms of understanding the fractionation of these volatiles during core mantle atmosphere differentiation of these bodies, and how that process may have contributed towards heterogeneous accretion of these volatiles as the Earth kept growing. And so definitely has a good connection to Catherine's talk about isotopes as the tracers, because of course, are they coming from NC type of bodies or are they coming from CC type of bodies, and what type of fractionation of volatiles you may be expecting in them. So when we are talking about impacts, it's not just impact on Earth, it's also impact between bodies that made Earth. So at various stages, impacts are involved and fractionation of volatiles are involved. That's what my talk is about. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Raj. Jamie.
Hi, so I'm Jamie Elsla. I'm at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, and my talk was about delivery of organics, primarily looking at soluble organic compounds that are present in meteorites and other extraterrestrial materials that might have been delivered to the early Earth through impacts. And this includes things like amino acids, carboxylic acids, other small molecular building blocks that we know are essential to life on Earth. And some of the big message is that there is a rich organic chemistry present in meteorites that was probably delivered to the early Earth, but it's a very diverse. If we look at different types of impactors, different types of meteorites, we see different distributions of these compounds. So if we want to understand what was delivered, we need to know more about the diversity and the distribution of those different types of materials, which I know some of the other talks focused on. And so that's really the take-home message is there's a lot of organic chemistry that was delivered by impactors, but it's hard to say exactly what without understanding what impactors were important.
Thanks. Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt. I am a new professor now at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, so moving from Florida, so dodging hurricanes and everything like that. And I really like the session I was in because it kind of introduces, especially for those people who are maybe in a bit more of the chemistry side of things, sort of the concepts that dominate cosmochemistry and early geochemistry, from siderophile elements and all these other things. Yes, I did move. And so, and how these things have kind of influenced the development of the sort of origin of life as well. So my own specific focus is on the element phosphorus, which in fact is a siderophile element. It's not really considered a volatile element compared to, say, carbon or nitrogen or hydrogen, but it is one of those that is strongly siderophilic. And hence, in that case, it's often considered probably most of the Earth's phosphorus is in the core. And so core material delivered after sort of the Earth's differentiation would have been a good source of trace elements, trace metals, and the element phosphorus as well. So it was kind of I love seeing the overview that kind of reiterated that a couple of times over, and how diversity of different types of meteorites plays a role in that as well.
Thanks. Jesse. Is Jesse on? All right, if Jesse joins us in a little while.
Sorry, hold on.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Sorry,
great.
I joined late here and having technical difficulties after.
No worries at all.
Sorry about that. Are we just doing introductions? I just joined, actually. I just got my
yeah, if you
things
could
figured out.
just give us a 1 minute of main takeaways from your talk.
Yeah, sure. My name is Jesse Remick. I'm a professor at Penn State, assistant professor at Penn State University. I think my talk on sort of what the Earth looked like prior to impact, the main conclusions are we don't really know. There's not much consensus in the community about what the early Earth looked like, I think, is the main topic. There are a few things that I would say are broadly consensus. There's some consensus built around them. And that this sort of idea of a hellish environment was probably not accurate, at least by 4.35 or 4.2 billion years, that there was liquid water on the surface of the Earth that we can see in the zircon record, and that there is some rock record from that time period, basaltic rocks and limited zircon content. But apart from that, we don't really know. I think everybody you ask who works on the Earth would have a different view of the planet at that time. So yeah.
Thank you. And last but not least, Stephen.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Stephen Kane. I'm a professor at UC Riverside. And I think about planetary habitability in a broad context, but the focus of my talk was particularly about the comparative evolutionary history of Venus and Earth, and where did their water inventories come from. And for the talk, I focused on planetary architectures, and especially the role of giant planets. And the reason that's important is because when we look at exoplanetary systems, giant planets beyond the snow line are relatively rare at about the 10% level. And so insofar as Jupiter and the other giant planets played a role in Venus's and Earth's initial inventory, then that's going to be critically important when we're considering exoplanetary systems. And so in my talk, I presented the results of a number of N-body simulations that I've been running over the past couple of years of the effect of Jupiter scattering material interior to the snow line and how much of that material would have impacted Earth and Venus. And it's essentially a study of the angular momentum distribution and the combination of Jupiter and Saturn, where they start to oscillate each other's orbits, greatly enhances their scattering effect and that flux of volatiles to the inner part of the systems. Thanks.
Whoops, unmute. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for the introductions. All right, so this is the first of our discussion sessions, and so folks can raise their hands if they've got questions they'd like to pose. We also, if you want to put your questions in the chat, because we've got a lot of people online, and I don't know how easily I'm going to be able to see people raising their hand. So put your questions in the chat, and one of our other conveners will be monitoring that. But in the meantime, as we wait for some questions to come in to start the discussion off, I'm going to throw this one out to our speakers from this session. As you listened to the other talks from the people in this session, did you find any new connections or things that you thought that you might look at in a new light? As someone who does, so I look at meteorites, and I also look at the effects of impacts on icy bodies. I was curious after listening to Catherine's talk. I don't know if anyone has done any connections between the elements that she's looking at and the abundance of organics in meteorites, and whether that relationship could tell us something about their histories.
You actually picked up on something that I thought, hey, that's actually quite interesting. So it's the organic chemistry that could happen on a CC body, and potentially on an NC body as well. So I found that the organic chemistry talks, although it went way back to where I was trained in this at chemistry and at university, it was really fascinating. And I do think that there is plenty of work that can be done, particularly on what volatiles can be in the NC region.
Awesome. Okay, so Zoom is happier than I thought it would be. It actually is bringing people with questions to the top. And so I'm going to alternate back and forth between someone online and then questions from the chat. And so Eduardo, I see you have your hand up. You're still muted.
Sorry.
No worries.
Sorry. First, to address that person about the amino acid survival, Jennifer Blank did high impact experiments in the early 2000s with mimicked comets impacting Earth with a little bit of water and amino acids, and high impacted them at velocities of 5,000 plus. And not only did they survive, they combined into polypeptides. So yes, they do. That's very important. To that, I want to add, has anybody looked at, because that experiment, the way she did it, she put water as a substitute for ice. And what I'm thinking is that during that time, if volatile elements were present in the oceans, such as amino acids, any impact, whether that asteroid or comet or whatever had amino acids or not, the water would. So any impact, I believe, would lead to more polypeptides being formed with every single impact, regardless whether that comet or asteroid or meteorite had. And has anybody looked into because recently they just put out experiments in Copenhagen addressing, intrinsically disordered proteins. Intrinsically disordered proteins are the ones that control gene expression and many cellular processes. So I would see that this would be a very viable path of these impactings causing amino acids to combine and then forming intrinsically disordered proteins that would create biochemistry. And the second thing, sorry,
Why don't we
because
let
this is a,
people, hey, Eduardo,
okay,
let's let people answer the first part of that question, and then we'll circle back around if we've got time for a second question. But I should also mention to folks, if we don't get to your question, please put them in the chat, because we will be saving the transcript of all of this so that we'll have it, and you can reach out to folks afterwards. I just want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask questions. So does anyone want to address some of what Eduardo has posed?
Eve, I can take an initial stab since I am familiar with this. So Eduardo, that's a really great point. Jen Blank's study from 2000 looked at relatively low impact conditions, which you could correlate with a possible but still relatively low probability impact of like a glancing blow. So you can correlate the impact velocity roughly with the probability of the impact velocity with an angle of approach, and then that angle of approach can be converted to a probability. And it's possible, but on the low side. So that's one section to think about. On the other extreme, a more direct impact, or let's say the most probable impact, that'd be a comet actually coming in at 45 degrees relative to the horizon, things will be obliterated. And then there's also a middle region where lots of complexity happens. So you might shock harder than Jen looked at, and you'll get not just peptides, but very large structures as well. So I think there's just a huge diversity of things that can happen.
Thanks, Nir. Anyone else want to comment on that, or shall I move to the next question?
Well, that was my point, that there will be thousands of lower, smaller bodies impacting the Earth. And also, if it's an ocean-covered Earth, then you'll have thousands, if not millions, of smaller impacts into the ocean, which create, I would think, an abundance of amino acids and polypeptides.
I agree.
Being able to interact.
Yeah, there's.
I think just on large bodies like comet or asteroid, I think would be, you know, missing out a big portion of what most of the impacts would be like.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's also the size of the impactor we've seen, because that dictates a lot of things like how long the material spends at given high temperature, high pressure conditions, and so forth. So there's a huge diversity there, and she, you know, thankfully at least scratched at the surface.
Okay, so we have a question from the chat. Wondering how amino acids and prebiotic compounds survived impacts given the high temperatures and pressures. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Or we can have that as a potential discussion point for later. People want to think about it a little bit.
I briefly mentioned this in my talk. Sorry to give a quick plug, but I'll just say that so Eduardo mentions that with some excellent points. The answer is very complex. So you get peptides and you get a lot of other stuff too.
Awesome. Thanks, Nir. Ben, why don't you unmute yourself and...
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My question's for Matt Pasek. I really enjoyed your pre-recorded talk, especially the mention that you had to tektites as a source of reduced phosphorus. And I'm wondering what the original source of the phosphorus is for tektites, whether it's, you know, like apatite in the crust that gets reduced by the impact, or if it's maybe schreibersite from the impactor that remelts. And also how much phosphorus did you find in the tektites?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question. And, you know, the short answer is we don't know. There have been people who have looked at tektites before, and they do find schreibersite in a few. This is going back into the 1960s. The presumption might be that it's probably an intrinsic impact process. So there's some reducing agents that happen to be next to some phosphorus source, probably like a phosphate, calcium phosphate possibly, and it mixes, and then you get schreibersite, because these are not really meteoritic because they don't have much in the way of nickel. And so they're almost pure iron phosphide. The amount we found was not insignificant. Some of them are definitely a lot more. There's some variation. We tried 4 different ones. One had none. And that's actually the Indochina tektites. But the other three we looked at had anywhere from a little bit, maybe like 2 to 5% of the total phosphorus, and up to one of them had, it was at the Moldavite, that had 40% or so of these more reduced forms as well. So my thoughts are it's either sort of part of the intrinsic reduction process during the impact, or it might be some sort of mixing between the impactor and the impact ground that kind of mixes things together. So that is a fantastic question, one that we're considering too. So
Thanks a lot.
Okay, so we've got a question in the chat for Catherine. In the CCNC discussion, comets are not really mentioned. Is the assumption that comets are not relevant for these isotopic systems, or are they similar to carbonaceous chondrites?
That's a good question. Thanks, Simone. So I think that the answer would be we don't have molybdenum or siderophile element isotopic data from comets, so we don't know the answer. I think people would place them more likely in the CC group, but that is based on the assumption that CC is from the outer solar system, of which there's no direct evidence for that. It's nicely implied. So I would say open question, and if someone can give me some comment, I will analyze it for you.
Excellent. I'd like some comment too while we're at it. Giovanni, you have a question or a comment?
Hello. This question is for Stephen Kane. I really did like your talk, and also from looking at your bookcase, I do like the tie interceptor that you have at the top, slightly hidden. But my question, first of all, it was really cool to hear yet another way how giant planets can play a role in affecting a planetary system's habitability or planetary habitability evolution in general. But one of my one of my questions was more on seeing how these giant planets affect the habitable zone, especially in terms of the delivery rates of these volatiles and how volatiles can play a role in, a planet's ability to, in terms of feedback, planet's ability to retain heat. Would you say these giant planets are affecting the habitable zone in terms of, its width, in terms of narrowing or widening? Or is it really playing a role in almost offsetting the location of the habitable zone, but not really affecting its width?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The effect of the giant planets that I spoke about on water delivery is certainly one aspect in terms of how much water is being delivered to that region. But then you get into the relative amounts of how much is coming from accretion versus how much is being delivered, of course. So there's that. One of the things I showed in my presentation is that you can get a substantial amount of impact of flux much further in than you might think for the inner parts of systems. Obviously, you have to convolve that with the impact of cross-sectional area, which, as I spoke about, is actually for Venus, since it has a much shorter orbital period, can get a higher amount. So in that sense, related to your question, you could say, well, doesn't that extend the habitable zone further in if that's where there's a lot of water being delivered from beyond the snow line? However, of course, the habitable zone is really about the energy budget of the planet through time. And so you have to be able to have long-term maintenance of temperate surface conditions. And so that once you convolve it in with that, of course, then we end up with that potential scenario for modern day Venus where, yes, it may have had huge amounts of even more water delivered to it than Earth did actually from beyond the snow line, but it just couldn't keep it, which is why a possible explanation of why we see the high deuterium to hydrogen ratio in the Venusian atmosphere due to massive amounts of water loss. So it's a combination of those two things. And I appreciate your love of the stuff on my shelf as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question for Raj online. What is your opinion on the origin of terrestrial hydrogen in water? Is it from NC or CC? Or I'm going to add to this question, or comets?
Yeah, that's a great question, Simone. I think based on the isotopic composition, the DH ratio of the terrestrial mantle, the match is better with CCE or various type of carbonaceous chondrite. However, there also has been recent claims, you probably are aware, by Laurette Piani, Sierpe Genosi, that if you look at hydrogen content of the nominal anhydrous minerals in enstatite chondrite, the total budget potentially can be matched with what has been estimated. Although I think jury may be still out there on that topic because there are newer analysis that potentially suggest some of those might be terrestrial water contamination, and maybe you need, in that sense, CC type of bodies to bring in the total inventory. One angle I did explore a little bit in my talk is if you look at not just hydrogen by itself, but the hydrogen to carbon ratio, none of the CC or NC undifferentiated meteorites, meaning enstatite chondrites or carbonaceous chondrites, can explain the H3 ratio of bulk silicate earth or the superficial reservoirs. So we may learn, and that's part of the pitch I made in my talk, is instead of asking for a single volatile, what reservoir is it coming from, if we ask for two or more volatiles together where it's coming from, we might be getting more challenges than answers. So the short answer is I don't know whether I have an opinion. In terms of absolute budget, yes, it's possible to do it with enstatite chondrite alone. But if you look at in combination of other volatiles, it's not so simple.
Thanks, Raj. We've got a question for Jesse. I want to bring him into the conversation from the chat. And then I also had a question for Jesse that I'm going to tack onto the end of it shamelessly since I'm emceeing this portion. Okay, so the question online, Jesse, is from your work on zircons, can you constrain when oceans first appeared? And then my question for you is, when I was listening to your talk and you were saying there's lots of different opinions, right, about what the early Earth looked like, what is the #1 measurement that you think is needed for people to kind of converge? Like what work would you like to see done? So again, you constrain oceans with zircons, and then what kind of work would need to be done to kind of bring folks at least in the same book, if not in the same chapter?
Okay, so the first one's easier to answer. When constraints on when the oceans formed, we're dealing in a place where we have conflicting approaches to that question. So every zircon or rock sample that we have on Earth going back in time has evidence for oceans. That could be the Costa complex at 4GA, the Nouveau-Naugatuck supercrustal belt, maybe 4.2 or 3.8, or the Jack Hill zircon that go back to 4.3, roundabout there. We can debate about the second decimal place there, but 4.3 billion years old. They all contain evidence for an ocean. I just saw a paper in American Mineralogist that came out last week. I haven't read it yet, but confirming these observations. So, we know it's there by then. Working from the other direction, when we don't have any samples, is a modeling exercise, which there's probably people in the audience who know a lot more about magma ocean simulations and things like that, about whether an ocean's possible for any, when it becomes sort of viable after planetary accretion and moon forming impact and all that sort of stuff. So that's the data. It's pretty simple. If we have rocks, they show evidence for low, quote unquote, low temperature liquid water. This is the one sort of data set that you'd like to see. That is the hardest question, and I've seen very good speakers get stumped by that question. I think there's no one data set. I mean, it's more samples from this time period, and I think what we need is a concerted effort to explore regions that will return more either old zircons or rocks that we can debate about their age and find them. The history of discovery of rocks of things of this vintage are usually just people going on exploration. It's not really hypothesis driven science. It's like, let's go look. We don't know the age of this complicated deformed basement ice assemblage, and we find some old ones. It's sort of a bit more random than like really clearly laid out hypothesis testing. So we need more scientific fishing expeditions in regions that are unexplored, I think.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm going to bring the conversation back around to some of the what is going to be in the impacts. So Jamie, you have a couple comments in the chat about we definitely need a comet return mission, sample return mission, and the answer is always more samples. And as a sample scientist, I wholeheartedly agree with you. What type of sampling from a comet would you want to see? And do you think that that material could survive impact into Earth? And what did we learn from Build 2, which was, of course, our sampling of the coma of the comet?
Right. Well, let me talk for a second about what we're learning from the current sample return missions we have with Ryugu and Bennu. And going back to the comment that was in the chat earlier about the L-amino acid excesses, we see one thing in the set of meteorites that we have on Earth, and we see excesses of left-handed amino acids with more aqueous alteration of the meteorites. The Ryugu data showed a racemic mixture of amino acids, which is interesting, not an excess of the L-amino acids. And so there's some questions about whether, if we go out and we grab a sample, when you bring it back and it hasn't gone through that impact on the Earth's surface, are we going to see something different? Because Ryugu and Bennu both are showing us some different distributions of amino acids and different compounds than we see in what has actually impacted on the Earth's surface. So I do think that sample return is a valuable technique, a valuable possibility to go out and see what was initially in these impactors versus what has survived on the Earth's surface. And for comets, I'd love to go see a comet surface sample return. I mean, the deeper the better, the more into the interior, but given current technologies, I don't know how deep we can go. But just to get a sense of what is in this cometary material. And as far as the impacts and the survivability, I think there's other people that some have been in the chat already who looked at what might survive the impacts. But I would love to go see a comet surface sample return mission, compare what the organic content of that with what we're seeing from our asteroid sample return materials, with what we see from the meteorites that have landed on Earth. And that would give us a better understanding of the inventory. So yes, the answer is always more samples. And more context for the samples, which you get from sample return.
Awesome. So semi-related question from Ismail in the chat. Based on the evidence so far, can we estimate the total of the biologically relevant mass of material delivered by impactors during the Hadean? I'm going to say I said that wrong. I'm sorry, all geologists. And is that relevant to the survivability of biological precursors? So how much material and how much of it needed to survive for us to see what we see? Open question to the panel.
I think that's a really great question. That's an example of the kind of thing that we're all coming at from different angles. We can look at what is present in certain kinds of meteorites. Other people are looking at the survivability and then what types of impactors. I'm interested to see what other people say, but it looks to me like a question that needs multiple approaches to it.
All right, we are getting close to the end of this session, and so I just want to invite each of our speakers to have a closing comment before we move on to the next session, which is going to be led by my co-host, one of my co-hosts, Nir Goldman. So let's go ahead and go through in the same order we started with. Catherine, do you have any closing comments and thoughts?
I'd say that, especially to the last point, we certainly need more samples, but I think in some ways, samples that we already have can be approached from different perspectives, particularly, let's say, with Raj. There are some ways that we can coordinate what we do, and I think we're asking the same questions, all to Ismail's last question. So yes, definitely, we need samples, but I think we could maybe coordinate analysis even better. Thanks.
Thanks. Raj?
Yeah, no, that's a great point by Catherine. I think there are a lot one can do with existing samples from meteoritic collections and so on. But the other thing, I mean, this is like a thought, like a burning question, and I think it has come up from many in the audience, that what portion of the volatile elements were biologically available versus what portions were available but may not be biologically relevant. I don't think we know the answer to that question at this point. in many talks I have given, I have kind of parsed it out, saying like there are two ways of making life originate. One is it's almost like doing a takeout, that you bring ready to consume materials that are biologically relevant through meteoritic deliveries or cometary deliveries, or you bring the ingredients that are necessary at home and do the cooking at home and through endogenic processes and make the in our group, or many in the community have taken the latter approach, trying to understand the elemental budget of Earth and how it got established. Others, clearly, many in this audience have taken the approach of organics delivery. And I think even these two communities need to kind of come together a little bit, like how much was organic delivery, ready materials, versus how much was a more simple building blocks and that were reprocessed on Earth. Thanks.
Thanks, Raj. Jamie.
Yeah, I agree with both what Catherine and Raj both just said as well. I think, I guess what I'm getting out of this workshop is the interconnections between all of our individual areas of work and the how complex this question is and what were the original building blocks and where did they come from? Is it the exogenous? Is it the endogenous sources? What does the impact itself do to the delivery and creating new compounds? And, what were the different types of materials that were delivered? We know from meteorites that not all, from our meteorite organic analyses, they're not all the same in terms of what they contain. So understanding that distribution of what were the main impactors to the Earth is really important in understanding that delivery of organic compounds. So I think it's very interesting to have these types of workshops and try and bring these different approaches to the question together.
Thanks. Matt.
Yeah. So Nicole actually has some good papers that she's posted in chat about that people have kind of tried to figure this out. And so I'll echo that there's a difference between molecular sort of chemistry that people study and also the elemental perspective. And I think that the session kind of had a nice approach of both. And it's an open question, and sort of how things mix up is a very big part of understanding the origin of Earth, and then sort of the subsequent habitable post-accretionary habitable time period for the Earth. And I think that that's a very nice takeaway from this session here. So I appreciate that part.
Thanks, Matt. Jesse.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much scientific insight to add, but I appreciate all the talks. I've learned a lot about, echoing the last two comments here, sort of learned a lot about the interplay between all of these fields and thought about some biology I haven't thought about since my undergrad by watching the talk. So thank you.
Of course. And Stephen.
Yes, thank you everyone for all the talks and the insightful comments. I just have a closing note, a bigger picture comment. As I mentioned earlier, it seems pretty clear at this point that the architecture of our solar system is quite unusual relative to what we're seeing elsewhere. And I sometimes refer to what exoplanets bring to the table as a statistical hammer, because as much as I'm extremely interested in the evolution of Venetian surface geology and hydration, and where did that water go, or at least where did the oxygen go when it lost the water. This is something that can be tested in a much broader context. And so I'm listening to this and taking in all these ideas, trying to make predictive models that can be applied elsewhere. So for example, when we look at an exoplanetary system that has a bunch of inner terrestrial planets like our system, but no giant planets, what do we expect to see or infer of their water inventories? So looking forward to having more of those conversations.
Thank you very much. And again, if you have questions or that you think of things later that you'd like our panelists to think about, please put it in the chat, because again, we will be saving that. And apologies, I had it backwards. Simone is going to be leading us next on a discussion of what happens at the point of impact. So Simone, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Just a second. For a second, I thought my yeah. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I would like to thank for being here today. This has been a great workshop so far. You will notice that our schedule has shifted a little bit. And so I will keep the next session running for 30 minutes as we have originally planned, starting from now. So just we will adjust that. But we are now talking about what happens at the point of impact. And so we're making sort of progress into a timeline from what was available on the Earth to what happened once we start having collisions, and we'll make further progress in the next sessions along those lines. But for now, what happens at the point of impacts? We have 4 talks here lined up. They're all very interesting and exciting. I hope everyone had the chance to watch the recording. I also want to point out that all the recordings will be made available, and so they will remain in perpetuity, like a permanent snapshot of what we understand today about many of these processes, and people can go back later and use those as a reference as they start thinking more about these topics. And so without any further ado, I would like to get started with Robert Sprun presenting the fate of impactor materials.
Hi. Yeah, so we were interested in where the materials of these types of late accretion impacts are delivered. So late accretion is just all the impacts that occurred after the moon forming impact. And based on the HSE excess in the Earth's mantle, we can constrain the amount of material delivered. It'd be concentrated in a few larger bodies, but perhaps up to a moon-sized body. And specifically with respect to early habitability, we're interested in the deposition of iron. So there's been recent work suggesting that even though the Hadean Earth was supposed to have a more oxidizing environment, the delivery of reducing iron during these late accretion impacts, so the delivery of this metallic iron in these late accretion impacts could actually cause temporary, more reducing environments that's more amenable to the development of these precursors to say RNA world or RNA first origin of life. And we were also looking at the catastrophic effects of these impacts as well. So whether or not these impacts would be sterilizing. And we find that a lot of the iron delivered based on our 3D numerical simulations can be sequestered into the early Earth's mantle, but some fraction of that material can be deposited into the surface and to the early Earth's atmosphere, and then therefore be available to create these transient reducing environments. But in order to have this system where this late delivery of iron creates this more habitable transient reducing environments, which is kind of helpful for the early origin of life, you need a large amount of iron delivered, but you also need the subsequent impacts to be sufficiently small that they don't cause kind of global sterilization. So that's the summary of our work.
Thank you, Robert. Next one is the shock synthesis, the experimental approach. And we have Yoshihiro Furukawa. Please, if you can give us a quick 60-second summary of your talk.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I just confused the time difference. I thought it EST, but it seems to be EDT. I just introduced my work. So
just a verbal description. You don't need to have slides or anything. People will have watched your talk. So just a verbal short introduction, that would be enough.
Yes. So what I want to say in this presentation is impact was very frequent on the Hadean Earth to the early Archean Earth, and this contains a lot of metallic iron, and that metallic iron can work as reductant to reduce the surrounding materials on the Earth, like CO2, N2, and that can make many organic compounds, including amino acid and potentially nucleobases. And in this presentation, I just introduced the difference of the projectiles and the micrometeorites and big impact, what these type of impacts and delivery contribute to the prebiotic chemistry? Thank you.
Thank you. Next one is Nir Goldman, shock synthesis, the modeling aspect of it.
Hi, thanks. So our approach to shock synthesis modeling has been through quantum mechanics. So I think for the larger scale modelers, you want to think you're zooming in on a single material element, some very tiny periodically replicated box of material. And then we want to use quantum mechanics to study the shock-induced chemistry because that incorporates as few assumptions as possible into the model. Really, you just have a Hamiltonian that describes how things are interacting, and then you supply the shock compression wave, and you can do numerical experiments and hopefully make realistic predictions for a real experiment. I think there are a couple of take-home points. One thing we looked at is that you can have a largely oxidized environment, so an environment that's CO2 rich but has water, and if you shock compress it, you can get interesting prebiotic chemistry. So the shock compression itself supplies so much energy that that's very useful. The second thing is you can do studies related to the survivability of amino acids, and you can see that even if they don't survive, there is an interesting window of thermodynamic opportunity where further complexity can happen, like the amino acids can condense and form larger structures, et cetera. I think the biggest take-home point, though, is that we've barely scratched the surface here. Our goal is really to look at the very initial stages of chemistry, sort of in very tiny material elements, with the hope that someone can do real experiments and confirm what we're seeing.
Thanks, Neil. Next one is Matthew Huber with an observational evidence from the Bradford impact structure.
Hi. Yeah, so I am trained as a geologist, and so I was talking about some of the evidence that we see from the Bradford impact structure. Bradford is among the oldest impact structures on Earth, and it is the largest, but it has been deeply eroded. So a lot of the things that were talked about in other talks were looking at things like the hydrothermal system or the near surface environment, which at Bradford, we wish that it was still preserved, but it's not. What we do see is that the melt that's generated on the surface of the Earth when the impact happened actually descended to great depths. And so we still have impact melt, even though we've eroded the crater 10 kilometers down, we still see impact melt dikes. And we have a lot of evidence that the impact was hot and structurally active for a protracted period after the impact. So the implication of that, of course, is that habitats aren't really restricted to just the very surface area, but we could have elevated temperatures and the necessary components to be driving a hydrothermal system even at significant depth for significant periods of time after the impact.
Thank you, Matthew. So this it's the last talk in this section, and so it's now time to open up the floor for questions, for additional discussion along the lines of the topics that we were just mentioned by the four speakers. And so if you have questions, please raise your hand, and we will go through the questions there. I will also try to monitor questions in the chat, and so we'll try to do our best to keep the conversation going. But I already see there is hand raised. That is Ben. If you don't mind, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. My question's for Nir Goldman. I was really interested to see the use of quantum chemistry to predict impact thermochemistry. That's a use of quantum chemistry I haven't seen before, so I was pretty excited by it. I'm interested in what sort of validation you can use to potentially validate your results, perhaps with impact experiments, or maybe some sort of field studies, if you're thinking about this. And then maybe also validating it with other forms of predictive chemistry like classical thermodynamic modeling.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you. The easiest handshake here are shock recovery experiments. That's where, with both prebiotic and non-prebiotic systems, we've had luck. So we can tell, the goal here is for us to narrow down the conditions for an experimentalist to look at. So we can tell them a given hypothetical composition, icy composition to look at, and the thermodynamic conditions to shock up to. And then the experimentalists shock, release everything and then scrape out whatever's there and analyze it and hopefully see something we predicted. That's the easiest handshake. I think there are ways to connect to larger scale simulations. So that would give us an even better handshake with experiments. So maybe we would look at classical molecular dynamics. So we're skipping the quantum mechanics and parameterizing something and then doing molecular dynamics that way. Or you can do very large scale simulations. There are other approaches that can let you get out to simulation timescales of seconds or decades, et cetera. And I think that would be using the chemical reaction network there itself. That would be predetermined by maybe something lower scale. So that's another way to connect to experiments. And then finally, in terms of field studies, I think that's hard, but that's very doable. For example, if you have a mineral that has a very clear signature of some kind of thermodynamic path, and that mineral also has then some chemistry associated with it, some organic chemistry embedded in it, then that would be a way we would connect as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I would like, if anyone else has a question, please don't be shy, raise your hand and go through those questions. In the meanwhile, while people are perhaps still thinking about a question, I do have a follow-up question for you, Nir. Well, first of all, the first question that comes to mind to me, I'm not an expert on this kind of simulations, but it's very fascinating. So the question I have, reading some of the papers, and sometimes they refer to this methodology ab initio, and so I was confused if it is, in fact, an identical approach to what you do to your quantum simulations, or if that is different in some way. It's just maybe a terminology question, but if you could clarify that. And then another questions I had regarding the chemistry that you see happening in these simulations. I was trying to understand, is it that meant to be, high pressure, high temperature, but it's meant to be in which phase? Is it impactor material gets, at the shock moment when there is very high pressure? So is that very moment that you are simulating? And is it the solid phase? Is it the vapor phase? Or does that matter at all? I was just trying to get a little bit more insights on imagining precisely what's happening here.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. Those are also great questions. So yes, we do ab initio simulations. Ab initio is another word for quantum. In terms of condensed phases, there's really only one ab initio or quantum approach available. It's called density functional theory. So those who are practitioners know what it is, and those who aren't, it doesn't really matter. In terms of our simulations, we try to simulate 3 thermodynamic stages. So high pressure, high temperature, that's the shock compression. Then there's pressure release. So you have low pressure, but then the high temperature remains, and then finally you cool and equilibrate. In general, we find that trying to accurately model all 3 stages is important. If you skip one of those stages, like for example, you shock compress and you only look at the chemistry there, it'll be very different than what you would get under equilibrium conditions, of course. And also, if you release the pressure wave and temperature and you do it too quickly, for example, so it's unphysical in some way, that will also alter the chemistry. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying all 3 thermodynamic stages are important, and we try to capture that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for clarifying. I see there is a follow-up question. I'm not sure if that was completely answered before, but that would be the following. Is this computationally feasible to predict amino acid production destruction using your quantum chemistry impact simulations?
Yes. is the short answer. There are system size and simulation size and simulation timescale limitations due to the extreme computational expense of the quantum mechanical approaches, but you still can get some information. And then we also work on approximations to that quantum mechanical approach to get more realistic descriptions. But the short answer is yes.
Thank you, Nick. Let's see if there are any other questions. I don't see raised hands online, but if you do have, maybe there is a question here in the chat. Let me see. A question for Furukawa. Could you elaborate on the process that form amino acids and formaldehyde in the impact process?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'm not completely sure for the amino acid synthesis, but the formaldehyde is rather small molecules that can be reduced, that can form by the direct reduction of carbon dioxide to CO2 or formic acid, and then one more reaction to form formaldehyde. I mean, probably amino acids are formed between the reaction, including formaldehyde, ammonia, and for example, hydrogen cyanide is also a product of this kind of experiment. And if these three molecules react each other, they amino acid can be formed by the foremost Strecker reaction. And also other reaction is the foremost type reaction that can make amino acid between ammonia and formaldehyde. So I'm not completely sure the process that form amino acid, but there are a couple of processes.
Thank you. I see there is Bishal has a raised hand. He probably also typed in the question in the chat, but if you don't mind, given that you're online, asking the question. Okay, maybe not. Let's see if I can read the question. Can it be likely that the quantum tunneling effect could be the first trigger for the formation and evolution of life on Earth? For instance, according to the RNA world hypothesis, the RNA was more stable in primordial Earth. So my guess, whether the first active RNA might have happened due to proton transport phenomenon. Can you shed light on this? I'm not sure what this question is directed to. Can you clarify that, Bishal? Okay, if not, we will leave it there. And if someone feels has an answer to the question, you can type it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll carry on with other questions. And I would like to take the chance to ask one question to you, Yoshihiro. I enjoyed your talk when you tried to describe the effect of different sizes of impactor sizes, going all the way from micrometeorites to larger impact, larger asteroids. And you identified then two regions of interest in which material could either be delivered or are synthesized. And so I believe your point was that on the smallest scale, like micrometeorites kind of scale, that material could survive. And so clearly that's the direct delivery of extraterrestrial organics and other species. But on the other extremes, larger objects, you said that they might contribute significantly in terms of synthesizing. And so it's what you said, some endogenous synthesis of organic molecules. So which of the two extremes, if you will, do you think it might dominate scenario of the early Earth? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, it's a good question and a hard question to answer. So to get the answer, we are doing an experiment that we are analyzing meteorites and possibly the small micrometeorites possibly came from comets. So, but we don't have any good example of good material of exact comet material. And another problem to investigate the contents of organic compounds in the micrometeorites is that these samples are very tiny. So we cannot avoid the surface contamination. So when we analyze meteorites, we can analyze just inside of the meteorite, but we cannot avoid the removing the surface of the micrometeorites. So it's so far it's hard to answer this question, but the analysis of meteorites is going on. The many, like Jamie talked previously, people make progressing the very sensitive investigations of the micrometeorites. Also, like this symposium workshop, people trying to investigate the impact shock synthesis. So in the future, we can get some more reasonable answer, which to invest to just which sources are more probable.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yoshihiro, for that. I see we have a couple of raised hands, so I would like to go there, and then we'll come back with some additional questions that I also have written down somewhere. So first, I don't know what the order of the raised hand was, but I see first Ben, and so I'll let you go first.
Thank you. This question is for Robert Citron. I'm really interested in potential sources of reducing early Earth's atmosphere. So I was watching your talk with great interest. I think you mentioned that you needed a lunar size impactor in order to reduce one ocean mass worth of hydrogen. And it got me thinking about, you know, the correlation maybe between the size of the impactor and the amount of reduction potential, whether that was a linear progression, and say if you could, you know, if it was probable to have, say, 10 impactors that are a tenth the lunar mass, or you know, 100 that are 1% of the lunar mass, if you would get a similar result, or if you have any insight towards that.
Yeah. So when you look at when you look for a given impacting mass based on that's constrained by the kind of enrichment of HESEs in the Earth's mantle, just because of the power law distribution of impactors, you expect most of the mass to really be concentrated in a few larger bodies. So in order to get enough mass, like in a lunar mass object, if you were to have that distributed amongst smaller bodies, it would just be a lot more smaller bodies than we would think would be in that distribution based on the kind of power law scaling of the projectile distribution. Or if you wanted to deliver that much mass in bodies of smaller size, that implies that there would have been much more numerous bodies of even larger size than is kind of suggested or constrained by the HSC excess in the Earth's mantle. So we'd expect most of that delivery could have come in a few larger bodies. Now, something that could happen that could allow for it delivered in smaller impacts is if those larger bodies are more oblique collisions and some of that material is ejected from the system, then that could eventually loop back around and then reaccrete onto the Earth, even though if it was ejected in a more hit and run type collision. And since that material would be in smaller impactors in that point, then it might more likely stay on the surface. So that's a way you could have kind of a larger impacting body, but then have it broken up into smaller bodies that then might be better retained at the surface. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, now there is another question from Eduardo. Please go ahead.
Oh, yes. I guess this is a general question. Well, I don't know if all of you can give your opinion. When was the current level of ocean depth achieved? Was it during the Hadean era or after? And Yoshihiro, have you done any experiments on micro impacts in water at all? That was it.
Yeah, so maybe we can take Yoshihiro the second part of the question to you, and we can keep the larger and very difficult question to answer about ocean depth for the discussion that we'll have later. So please, Yoshihiro, if you can answer the.
Okay, thank you for the question. So I think you mean the direct impact on the water surface. So that is more ideal modeling, more ideal simulation experiment than my shock recovery experiment. But in that case, the projectiles spilled over in the chamber, so we cannot correct the product clean in the clean form. So many contamination present in the chamber. So I replaced to the kind of the direct experiment. I used the shock recovery experiment. That is more in the closed chamber and easy to collect these product samples. So yeah, I didn't do that kind of experiment, but some previous research showed the interactions, the formation of, for example, the CN, carbon and nitrogen, compound between the nitrogen in the chamber atmosphere and the carbon in the projectiles. So the impact paper can generate the molecules between the atmosphere and the projectiles. Yeah.
Thank you, Yoshihiro. And we'll get back to the first part of your question, Eduardo, in a moment. But before doing so, I would like to see if there are other specific questions for our speakers. And so please raise your hand. And we have a few minutes left for these sessions. And in the meantime, I will take an opportunity to ask a question to Matthew. Matthew, as you know, I am fascinated by the Rutherford crater and all the work that you and many others have been doing about the structure, which is really interesting. And one question that in fact, I wasn't quite aware of this until I watched your talk is the spheral layer associated with Rutherford. And now I've been intrigued by impact generated spheral layers for a while now. And so the question then for you is, can you elaborate a little bit more about the spheral layer generated by Rutherford? What can we learn from here comparing with other spheral layers? And say Chicxulub or even some of the older ones that are in the Barberton. So is there any detailed work about the spheral layers, or is it something that you're looking at? Yeah, anything you can add that would be of interest.
Sure. Right now, the Rutherford spheral layer is known from two different locations. One is in Greenland and the other is in the Karelian region of Russia. Rutherford is about 2 billion years old, and it is the oldest example we have of a pair between an impact crater and an ejected deposit. So the older Barberton layers, the spherules are a bit larger, the layers are generally better defined, and they're much older, but we do not have the source craters. Probably those are from much larger impact events. But Rutherford gives us a little bit of a constraint on that. Chicxulub is much younger. The ejected blanket is known from all over the world. And so we can compare those spherules and see that there's a similar types of morphology that come out of those. What we see with the Rutherford spheral layers, the two locations in Greenland and Russia, they're both age constrained so that we know within a relatively short window of time that these are the same age as Rutherford. From the chromium isotopes, we know that these two layers probably are forming from the same type of impactor, so they're probably representing the same event. And they have a similar platinum group element profile to the impact melt at Rutherford. So that's how we know that those are likely related. We can't be 100% sure, but it's very probable. One of the interesting things, the Karelian layer is known from ICDP drill core, and those spherules are found within a shungite deposit, where a shungite is a fossilized oil field. So there's a strong relationship between graphite and those spheral deposits. A lot of the spherules are actually filled with the graphite, or the organic material, and the same is true in the spherules that are in Greenland. The possibility is that the decomposition of the glass of those spherules actually was providing an easy pathway for organic material to hook onto and grow and stay, whether that was organics at the moment of impact or in the diagenetic environment. Yeah, so neither of those sites has been too extensively studied. Greenland is hard to get to. The ICDP drill core is really the only way that we know about the Karelian spheral layers, so there's definitely a lot of room for both of those to be explored a lot more. And the one other thing I'll mention about Vredefort that makes it significantly different than the Archean and Hadean impacts is that Vredefort was after the Great Oxygenation Event. And we do not have any craters on Earth older than the Great Oxygenation Event.
Yes, Matt, that's a great comment. Just to give a perspective on the fact that the craters that we see today on Earth formed when the conditions at the surface were very different than conditions on the D on Earth, which are relevant to many of the talks that we will see in this session. So I think we are approaching the end of the session. I don't see any other raised hand. However, I recall Eduardo's questions about a volume of water on the early Earth. If anyone, even from prior sessions, wants to make a comment on that, please go ahead. So I will have an open mic now for a couple of minutes. Anyone that wants to comment on the water content, please do so. Otherwise, you can type in your thoughts in the chat as well. So anyone wants to make a comment on that? I see Nir.
I had a quick comment for Eduardo that is only slightly related to what you just asked, Simone, but I think Yoshi had a very nice answer to sort of the difficulty for why it's around studying impacts within water. That is something we've also thought about. We tend to think about it more in terms of, well, water is a much more forgiving surface. And so that allows for maybe a larger range of impact velocities to be studied. But then the ensuing chemistry due to an external water environment, is a bit difficult to quantify exactly. I think you can look at an aqueous mixture and how that impacts and see what happens if that were impacting a hypothetical water surface or ocean surface. And that might give you an idea of what's going on.
Yeah, thanks, Nir. I also want to point out that some of the talks has specific comments about water, so you can find additional reference there. My own talk has some reference to key papers on the evolution of water on the early Earth, and Jesse talks and other talks have key references. So maybe it's something to keep offline because we are at the end of this session. And Eduardo, I see you have your raised hand. Do you want to make a final comment on this before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was just to see the not any chemistry, but just the survivability of amino acids contained within the body and then being dispersed into the environment. That was my concern. That's what I was curious about.
Right. Thanks for clarifying that. So if there is no other comments, no other question, Nir, you still have your raise hand. Do you want to have? Do you have another comment?
That was an accident, but
Okay.
yeah, Eduardo, great question. I think that's an open idea, which is when you deliver something, how does it react with the environment? I think we have some idea, but not a whole lot.
All right, so let's then wrap this up. And thank you so much, everyone, for your great talks and discussion and great questions and answers. So in the schedule now, we have a 15 minutes break. So let's just do that. We will reconvene it in 15 minutes. I will not attempt to say what the time is because we are all in very different time zones, and so I don't wanna make any confusions. But just say 15 minutes from now, and that is when we'll reconvene. In the meantime, for additional questions, please keep using the chat because all those questions will be eventually recorded. And so please keep doing so. And for the next section, we will have Neil Goldman that will be chairing the next section. So I'll see you back in here in 15 minutes.
Hi, everyone. It is 49 past the hour, according to my watch. So why don't we wait another minute or two? Looks like we have a lot of people logged online still. Let me get the... All right, it's 51 past the hour according to my watch. So in the interest of time, we might as well get started. So I'm particularly excited about this section of our workshop, which is how the impactor and target materials have been processed. For me, it's particularly fascinating because it looks at this, the talks in this session are looking at things like topography, the formation of hydrothermal systems, and how giving some speculation as to how that can affect chemistry. So we've had such a wide range of system scales that we've looked at in this session. So we've had atomic scale behavior and very chemical things, both experimental and computationally. And now we're going to look at sort of very large scale features of what happens to the planet or crust or similar things after an impact, and how that can also affect the chemistry. So this is definitely outside of what I normally think about, but it has very obvious direct relevance. So I'm now going to go down the list of speakers, and you each can give a roughly 60-second summary of your talk. Okay, Gordon, you're first.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me today. This is a topic that I've been interested in since the first year of my PhD, which was a long time ago, and there's maybe like 5 people in the world interested in impacts on life. So it's great to see so many people online today. The talk I gave was on a field and sample-based approach, looking at impact-generated hydrothermal systems. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion. And we'll leave it there.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Laura.
Yeah, hi, I'm Laura Schaefer. I'm a professor at Stanford University. And in my talk, I talked about some of the physical and chemical effects that impacts can have on the early atmosphere. And I started by talking about magma oceans because I can't resist even in an impact talk talking about magma oceans. But in general, we think that impacts can lead to magma oceans, which is large-scale melting of the mantle and crustal environment of the Earth. And this, I think, has really important implications for the atmosphere in terms of volatile partitioning, right? And some of those volatiles will get stuck down in the mantle as it crystallizes, and some will make it out. And I think some of the newer models for magma oceans that indicate that there's significant amounts of melt trapping really throws even more uncertainty, I think, on Eduardo's question about when did the early ocean form. I also talked a bit about how impacts can both deliver volatiles, but can also actually erode volatiles from our atmosphere. And the balance of that is something I think we're still working out. And then the last thing I talked about was really how impacts can change the large-scale chemistry of the atmosphere. I think Robert Citron in the previous session had mentioned this, but our late delivery of impactors were probably very reduced and could have created sort of transiently reducing atmospheres, regardless of what the background atmosphere was at that time. So I'm excited to chat more.
All right, thank you, Laura. Simone, you're next.
Yes. So in this talk, I was interested in describing a little bit the evolution of topography on the early Earth. The reason why topography is of interest for this workshop is that some of the theories about early life formations on Earth would require or would prefer if on the Earth was present topography, because the moment there is topography on Earth, you have access to different, widely different environments, not only the bottom of the ocean, perhaps, but also exposed land at the surface, and so which could trigger different sort of biochemical processes. And so the question is how did topography evolved on the early Earth? And I try to summarize what we understand today. Of course, you can imagine, for reasons obvious that were discussed in the previous session, we don't really know much about the DNA. So what I presented is more of a modeling work. But the idea that I presented here is what is the role of large-scale collisions in generating topography. And so what is the talk basically gives an overview of what we understand today about this process, which actually it's something kind of new. Has not been fully discussed in the literature in the past. So hopefully, I hope people had the fun thinking about these ideas.
Thank you, Simone. Next, we have Nuri and Amanda.
Hi, Nuri, I'll start if that's okay, since my talk was on the first half of the video. Thank you very much. My name is Amanda. I'm here at the Southwest Research Institute, and as Oz alluded to in his talk, hydrothermal systems in impact structures on Earth are prevalent. And so my talk was about the formation and generation of these structures as a result of the impact process through impact-generated porosity and fragmentation, and then how the impact flux of the Hadean may have resulted in a vast amount of permeable space available for that first 500 million years. And then Nuri talks about the implications of that.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nuri Park, and I'm a PhD candidate at Arizona State University working with Dr. Everett Schock. As impact events bring an energy that can support hydrothermal systems, in my talk, I presented the hydrogen potential of 11,111 water rock systems simulated by geochemical models. Since hydrogen can serve as a building block for organic molecules by reducing carbon species, an environment with high hydrogen potential may indicate a habitable place. So we tested a wide range of rocks from granite to ultramafic rocks, and since impacts can happen anywhere, and found that the heat brought by impacts sets an environment for high hydrogen potential for most of the rocks we tested, indicating that the impact events might have played a key role in producing abundant hydrogen that can synthesize organic molecules during the early Earth.
All right, thank you, Nuri. Now, Everett Schock unfortunately had to leave, but I believe, Nuri, you're going to give a summary of his talk. Is that correct?
I still
Everett's here.
Oh, Everett's here. Great. Hi, Everett.
Hi. I'm not always sure about my predictions, but this one came to pass. I pointed out a couple of times that teaching my class at 9 o'clock in the desert meant that I was probably not going to be able to participate, and that has come to pass. Yay! Anyway, so my presentation is about the potential in hydrothermal systems to an examination of what the consequences are for carbon chemistry. The highest temperature parts of hydrothermal systems are typically dominated by CO2. It's hard to reduce carbon at the highest temperatures, like above something like around 400 degrees centigrade, if you needed a reference point. Below that, we have mounting isotopic evidence that CO2 and methane can equilibrate down to below 300 degrees, maybe 275, something like that in the clumped isotope data that I'm familiar with. But then below that, the full stable equilibrium is not reached. And so the potential is there for CO2 reduction to organic compounds in normal hydrothermal systems unavoidable from impacts, or for that matter, many volcanogenic systems. And it's entirely ordinary for carbon to be pushed towards the organic synthesis at these conditions. And of course, life, methanogens, other autotrophs are some of the highest temperature organisms. And they know all about this already because they have to be able to not only make methane, but make themselves profitably. So it's trying to make the case that these kind of systems are poised to drive carbon chemistry towards biochemistry. And with that, I will have to go. Sorry.
All right. Thank you, Everett. Appreciate it. All right. The floor is now open for questions. Would anyone like to start? I'm happy to start off with a question for Laura. So keep in mind, I'm a chemist, but I was really intrigued by things you spoke about, like melt trapping of organics and things like that. But I also, that made me think about sort of the thermodynamic conditions of the melt and the timescales of the melt. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. So we think that there's within silicate liquids, a lot of volatiles are soluble. I don't know about organics specifically to a lesser degree, but carbon as in the form of CO2 or carbonate is very soluble. Well, sorry, not very soluble in silicate melt. Water is very soluble in silicate melt. Carbon is less soluble than water. And so the large scale partitioning during the magma ocean definitely depends on the relative solubilities of those volatiles, right? And I know there's a couple of experimentalists here who can maybe comment on that even better than I could. But even within, later impacts that might generate an impact melt sheet, partitioning of volatiles out of the atmosphere might draw some of those volatiles down and into that impact melt sheet before it cools. Which would remove a little bit of the volatiles from the atmosphere. In addition, there's some work from I believe it's Sakuraba et al. 2019 and 2021, where they were also looking at the partitioning of volatiles out of the atmosphere into an early ocean. Right now, that depends on how much early ocean you have, but impact erosion can then cause some loss of the stuff that's in the atmosphere, but the stuff that's in the ocean might then stick around, right? So the things that are more soluble in whatever liquid is present at the surface are less susceptible to that impact erosion process.
I see. How about the thermodynamic conditions of the melt, though? I mean, we're talking probably extremely high temperatures.
Right. Yes, very high temperatures, right? And so this is why I don't think that organics per se are soluble, although there might be sort of carbon hydrogen bonding in very reducing melts. You could get some of those kinds of sort of methane-like species dissolving in melts, or ammonia-like species dissolving in melts for nitrogen under reducing conditions. But thermodynamically, it is very hot, right? And within a magma ocean, the melt can extend to extremely high pressures as well, which certainly affects the overall sort of budget of volatiles that you might be able to dissolve into the interior.
Oh, thank you very much. I see a question from Tim. Tim, would you like to ask your question? If not, I will happily read it.
No, sorry, I can do it. I had to. Oh,
no worries.
We have the multiple computer in a room thing. What's that? Can I go? Okay, sorry. We were having feedback problems. This is something that Simone and I have discussed before about just how long-lived impact features would be. And I know it depends on so many unknowns, including how deep and persistent the ocean was, rates of erosion, et cetera. But are we talking in orders of magnitude? Are we talking about features that last for hundreds of years, millions, many millions? And this, of course, has implications for what kind of prebiotic chemistry can occur on them and how the products of those reactions can distribute.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can share some of the results. This is, by the way, it's an ongoing work, so picture yet. But what we find is quite intriguing. So the condition that we'll start with is the Adian, probably higher, much higher than today, geothermal gradient, meaning the crust is warm. And so naively, one would imagine that topography has the tendency to relax itself, right, quite quickly because of this warmer conditions. And so we simulated all this using a combined approach with different codes, and it turns out that in fact any impact generated topography could be quite long-lived, and it's a function of the parameter assumed, and certainly it is a function of the impactor size. For instance, depending how big is the the topography that you start off with, how big is your crater to start with. But for what we have seen so far, it's pretty long-lived, and I was indeed quite surprised. And by that I mean millions of years, tens of millions of years. And in fact, in one case, the largest impact that we simulated, it was topography will be able to last for hundreds of millions of years. The topography evolved drastically. You start off with a massive bowl, crater in the ground, and that evolved drastically, and you end up with a sort of islands popping up at the center. At the center, if there is water at the surface, the center rises up, and you can get this interesting looking sort of topography that evolves over time. But at any time, for tens of millions of years or even longer, you have a significant range of topography, and by that I mean several kilometers of topography can be sustained. So just to elaborate a little bit more, perhaps that's not to say that impacts were, the only process around. There could have been other processes generating topography, but what comes out of this work is the magnitude of the topography, which is significant in terms of vertical excursion, but even more so in terms of lateral excursion. So, as large as what of the surface of the Earth for the largest impact will have sustained impact generated topography, and so which I find it quite intriguing.
Right, thank you. Let's see. We have another question from a comment from Eduardo, who wrote, I have a very unique hypothesis. I boldly claim to be a theory with all the evidence I've accumulated from non-origin of life research. I only used observed natural phenomena to solve the question. Would you like to elaborate, Eduardo?
Sure. I'm sorry, I wasn't meant to send that yet. I wanted to wait
okay.
till after the talk.
Would you like to wait a minute?
Yeah, I don't want to interfere with with everyone presenting their. That's something I want to leave, for you guys to think about.
As you wish. Definitely the floor is open. I did have a follow-up question for Nuri, Amanda, and Everett if he were here, and this is a question about the evolution of hydrogen. So, I understand from a modeling perspective how, as a first step, that's likely to happen. But then, hydrogen is also a reactive species, so it dissociates very easily on rocky surfaces, and it absorbs easily in many cases, particularly with a defect-ridden material that you probably have in those conditions. You might have a partial oxide, for example. So, how important? I'm admittedly ignorant here. How important are those sort of secondary effects, like hydrogen absorption in the rocky surfaces, hydrogen dissociation? Because ultimately what you want is for the hydrogen to outgas, I assume, because that will lead to the most prebiotic, conducive atmosphere.
Well, I think in our modeling, I think we do account for the hydrogen dissociation, and I don't know about this surface absorption, but that may have to do with the reaction kinetics. But the chemical reactions that happen in aquatic systems are modeled in, and even when you model, even you account for that amount of hydrogen being dissociated and reacting with other perturbances, but the amount of hydrogen that is being produced from the water-rock interaction, I think is a dominant in our calculation that wins the other consequences. So that's one of the results that we have right now. And the details of the carbon-related hydrogen organic synthesis, I am not the expert in that organic realm. So yeah.
I see. So maybe that was the missing element for me, which is you're talking about something on the surface ultimately in an aqueous environment. So it's assumed that the hydrogen just outgasses.
Yep.
Got it. Thank you. Very interesting. Robert, you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah. Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Simone, following up on Tim's question. So what are the assumptions for the convective state of the early Earth in your model? So Earth's present bimodal distribution of kind of crustal thickness is based on continental versus oceanic crust, and how does it affect your model? What assumption do you use of mobile lid versus sluggish lid versus stagnant lid convection for the early Earth? I mean, if you do have subduction, that could also very quickly kind of normalize the crustal thickness or remove impact-induced topography.
So yeah, to move around the camera. Yes. What we have done so far, and as I said, this is still a preliminary take on this, is just isolating the effect of impacts. And so we make assumptions on the crust and mantle, we make assumptions of thicknesses, we make assumptions on their rheological properties, and then we make assumptions on geotherm, how warm the stuff is, and then we take an output of an impact simulations, we map into a finite element model, and we let it run. But this doesn't take into account that there might be additional long-term processes occurring, so if there is some other tectonic processes taking place that would be superposed to what we're doing. Expanding a little bit in that direction is what comes next. It's something that's left still to do. The reason why we started off with this approach is because we thought, well, any relaxation of topography will be extremely fast. That's what we were thinking. And so, in other words, we can sort of perhaps ignore the longer term evolution. But it turns out, in some cases, that the evolution can be quite long. And so we have to, certainly take into account this long-term evolution of mantle, for instance, and other processes that we haven't done so yet.
All right. Thank you, Simone. Gordon, your hand's up.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to kind of comment on, I think, the discussion around Simone's talk and then offer a link to the work on hydrothermal systems. I guess first the comment, I think that modeling is great, Simone. And, if we look to Mars, right, that's the most an Earth-like analog. We have topography preserved at the present day that's, impact topography that's 4 billion years old. So I think, the long-lived nature of impact topography on where we lack plate tectonics is, seems to make sense to me. And in terms of, you had a great kind of, one of your slides showed this idea of, an early Earth with lots of oceans, impact topography in the form of central uplifts, peak rings, peaks, and then rims. It's a neat analog for Chicxulub and that kind of marine impact. And we touched on this in this 2020 review paper, but the cool thing about that is depending on, doesn't really matter where you are on the subaqueous or subaqueal aerial hydrothermal origin of life, in one kind of impact crater, you can have both environments, in very close proximity. So you can have, these hydrothermal vents venting on the surface and wetting, drying out cycles, but also very close by. Maybe it's a closed lake basin or a closed ocean basin or the deep ocean, also these hydrothermal vents. So I think it's, bringing all of this together is really neat. and lots of variability, I think, in a very kind of small spatial extent.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank us for the comment.
Simone, your hand's up.
Yes, I do have a question, and in fact, the question is for us. So we can get back to this. And so I've, I'm familiar with your all the work that you have done for the characterizations of the hydrothermal systems on terrestrial craters, which is great work, and it's really a motivation for many of the modeling things that we do. So I would like to pick your brain about how is it possible to extrapolate, in a sense, what you see on terrestrial craters present, in the present, that you can study with rocks. How can we extrapolate this back into the end conditions? Now, the crust was very different in terms of compositions. Presumably, there were many other things that were different, and so how can we go about trying to constrain, from starting from a sample analysis point of view, what the conditions might have been for similarly impact generated hydrothermal systems, but on the Aegean Earth? Do you know any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and one that I've kind of thought about on and off definitely over the years. And it's there's no, we do not have a perfect surviving terrestrial crater that is the analog for one on Mars or Hadean Earth. So we've got to kind of pick different, use different terrestrial craters, I think, to get at different aspects. One of the craters I studied lots that many people might be familiar with is the Horton crater in the Canadian Arctic. It's fairly young and well preserved. It gives us, I think, one of the best ideas of the spatial distribution of where alteration occurs, but it formed in carbonate rocks. So that's a very poor analog, but we know it looking at many other craters that spatial distribution holds. A lot of people are interested in craters in basaltic targets, which we lack too many of. That will give us more of the, what's the mineralogy? What are the minerals being formed in the fluids that are going to occur, or a more realistic analog for early Earth and Mars in terms of the fluids and minerals being formed. So you would need to kind of put that together with, spatial distribution from Horton. Has anyone looked at, I know Suzanne Schwenzer did a nice paper on Mars that was, more of the geochemical modeling. I forget if she looked at, the more ultramafic rocks that would be perhaps an even better analog for Hadean Earth. So that's perhaps, a gap in the literature and our knowledge there that would be fun to investigate. From some of Alex's recent modeling, I think something we need to look at more, because it seems to play a big role on the longevity of hydrothermal systems, and I think on the mineralogy and what happens is whether it's ocean, whether there was a crater lake, or whether it was more of a kind of there was water around but relatively dry environment. And so I definitely think more numerical modeling looking at that is needed. So it's definitely not a one answer fits all, but we're getting there with little pieces of the puzzle, I think.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Eduardo, your hand's up.
Yeah, I spoke some about this in the comments in the chat. My thing is that the Earth's crust has changed so much, let's say just from the time of the dinosaurs, where we had Pangea, and you had the continents separate, and you had sublimation of the, at least of the oceanic crust. But all of that is occurring with saturation of oxygen throughout the whole surface. You understand the mineralogy and the introduction of oxygen into the mantle from those plates that were in in the saturation of oxygen. The mineralogy, I would assume, would change in the mantle from all of that being introduced into the mantle and mixed in. And that's what we would see now coming out of the volcanoes with current magma and volcanic vents. Has anyone considered that as, you know, how not being able to see or use our current volcanic activity and minerals, that I would feel that during the Hadean era, before the great oxidation event, the minerals and everything would be different.
I could maybe offer a quick response.
Yeah, I mean, this is not my field, so
Yeah.
but that's something I thought through my studies, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's why Simone was asking me, but I think that's perhaps where my answer ended up is, yeah, you know, you're correct. But we can use, you know, for example, there's a lot of impact craters we have on Earth today. They
Well, the
give us
mechanics of that would be the same,
yeah,
regardless.
they give us an idea about the distribution, fluid flow pathways, longevity, but we would need to couple that with models and modeling and experiments with more realistic starting conditions, you know, lack of oxygen in the atmosphere and more appropriate rock types. So put two and two together, and I think we probably do have a relatively decent understanding of what would occur.
I'll chime in maybe a little bit. You know, Bob Hazen has models where he's gone back and actually looked at the different mineral species present throughout time, and he does suggest that there has been an evolution in mineralogy as a result of oxygenation of the Earth's atmosphere. And so the mineral suite that might have been present on the early Earth might have been a little bit more limited than what we see now. But to your point about the crust, I'll bring this back to my favorite topic of magma oceans. We don't actually know what the crust looks like at the end of the magma ocean state going into the very beginning of the Hadean. I think this is something that is really poorly resolved in current magma ocean models. And this goes to my point about the outgassing of the atmosphere. If there's a lot of melt trapped at the end of the magma ocean state, you might end up with an atmosphere, you know, of 50 bars of CO2 with only a little bit of water that has actually been outgassed. But you still have a lot of melt trapped in your mantle, right? And that fundamentally changes the dynamics of the early Hadean. I would suspect a lot of volcanism in the aftermath of the magma ocean, even once the surface is crystallized. And so lots of melt production at the surface, which allows a lot of rapid weathering to happen and a lot of rapid pull down of that CO2. So I suspect you have a pretty carbonate rich crust also, which I think is kind of interesting to think about.
All right, thank you. So technically this session is now complete. I think we've gone slightly over half an hour, but we're into the open discussion part of our workshop. So I'm happy to continue moderating. So I can, if helpful, I can call on people who raise their hands and read questions in the chat. We have a few that have come up in the chat. So Amanda wrote, Oz, have you done any studies at Lonar?
I was just about to reply in the chat. The answer is a few, or not a lot. Lonar is an interesting example because I think there's still debate about whether the alteration we see is pre-impact versus hydrothermal generated by the impact. And, you know, to me, that's actually one of the outstanding questions, is the size threshold for where you'll start to get a lot of alteration in meteorite impacts. And Lonar is a couple of kilometers across and is probably right on that threshold.
All right, thank you. Matthew Huber wrote, hi Oz, do you have any thoughts about Chivaya Falls, where it looks like the hydrothermal system may be outcropping on Jezero crater?
I'm not familiar with it, or I can't picture that exact location off the top of my head, Matthew, but I'm super excited that you know, Perseverance is getting towards the rim of Jezero and I guess out from the post-impact volcanic infilling. And yeah, you know, we do predict both from observations of terrestrial craters and numerical models that you're going to get a lot of concentrated fluid flow in the rim region. So it would make sense that, you know, some of the alteration we see at Jezero could be from Jezero impact generated hydrothermal activity.
Right. Thank you. Tim wrote a general question. So he wrote, great point about terrestrial basaltic targets and related topography and isolated water masses because of the likelihood of alkaline water produced via weathering, which could factor into phosphorus availability scenarios per Catling, I think, and crew. Arguments for importance of alkaline lakes. Okay, so, any thoughts on resulting water chemistry?
Yeah, I'm here still. So from my position in all of this, when I first started and talking to Lauren Williams and others, there would be all these conversations about what if there were no land, if you need wet dry cycles. And there has been amazing things that have been spawned in that regard, including Simone's work about impact-related topography, but also if Jun Kornaga were here, he would talk about mantle plumes through a stagnant lid. These are really, really important questions. And the phosphorus problem, and this is probably as much for Matt as anyone, but it crosses over nicely into Simone's work. Catling and crew have been arguing for highly alkaline conditions, pulling down calcium, reducing appetite saturation, allowing for very high levels of phosphate, speaking to the phosphorus problem. Matt takes a different pitch on this, mostly, I think, by arguing for more reactive phosphorus, because the levels of phosphate you need to react abiotically are ridiculously high. And so, Matt, I'd love to hear you comment on this, because it's just occurred to me that if you get the right impact, it lasts long enough, and you have an alkaline lake sitting in the middle of that, I don't know what's possible. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's an interesting opportunity there with the alkaline solution solubility of phosphate, because you don't have to worry about the calcium as much, and so you can kind of drive phosphate concentrations that are delivered by weathering and other places kind of higher. Yeah, you alluded to probably a concern with the model is that you have high concentrations of phosphate, but it's like high quantities of carbon dioxide. It's a relatively inert compound compared to many others. And, modern biology uses a whole bunch of activated phosphates to do all its biochemistry. And there's a couple paths to getting phosphate in, but they really trump up the energy and kind of incorporate that. So if we're using sort of biology as a guide, it would be ideal to get more reactive forms to kind of drive the chemistry. And an impact crater, I think of something like the meteor crater, where you have chunks of iron meteorite hanging around too there, and that kind of serves as maybe an environment that might be good in that way, as well as kind of coupling some of that chemistry too. So I think there's plenty of good open questions to kind of work with that. The reactivity of phosphate is so low that it's usually easier to use some other compounds too.
Thanks, Matt. Oh, that's really fascinating. Well, I wanted to switch gears slightly because I had a question for Jamie about chirality. I don't know if you're still online, Jamie.
Yep, I'm still here.
Oh, great. So I have to plead a little bit of ignorance here, but so I'll walk you through what I know, and then maybe you can tell me how to think about things. So circular dichroism light can break symmetry. So you can have a very slight energetic favorability for, let's say, a left-handed amino acid over a right. My understanding is that energy difference is extremely small. So we're talking about if there's an excess that's created in the interstellar medium, it's going to be very tiny. And yet there's evidence of enantiomeric excesses that you showed, where there's actually an impressively large amount of L versus R amino acids. So how am I supposed to think about things exactly? How does one very tiny difference possibly lead to this gigantic difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so there's the thought that, you start with this very small difference, and then there's a mechanism for amplifying it and extending it. And that's where the work in meteorites that shows more of an enantiomeric excess in the meteorites that have had more aqueous alteration might be a clue to that there might be some solubility and crystallization differences, small ones that can amplify a very small excess initially and build it into the larger ones that we observe. And I saw Eve nodding along, and I see Aaron Burton in the participant list, and both Aaron did some work on this, and some other folks who aren't on the call right now. But yeah, it's the circularly polarized light is hypothesized to maybe cause that initial excess, but there does have to be an amplification mechanism, and that's still being studied. And Eve, I don't know if you want to add anything. Yeah.
I'm just going to add, I agree with everything you said. Also, things that we can look into are how those different handed amino acids interact with the host that they're in. So there might be small differences in binding energy. So if you think about being protected inside of a phyllosilicate mineral, you might survive where your mirror image might not. And also in line with crystallization and energies, there are folks who study salt-induced peptide formation, you can see things will grow preferentially as you cycle through drying and wetting cycles of a tidal pool on the early Earth. But I don't think the answer to that question is clear yet, but it's a great place where we could all maybe work together and think about processes outside of the box that we usually live in to try and find ways to experimentally simulate these things. Because maybe folks like Jamie and Aaron and I who are in the lab looking at samples, we're not maybe thinking far enough out of what other processes might be occurring. So great question.
Oh, thank you, Eve. Let's see. Bishal wrote, could the piezoelectric effects generated by high energy impacts on quartz-rich surfaces have played a role in catalyzing prebiotic chemistry on early Earth, and what experimental methods could validate this as a plausible mechanism for the emergence of life? Wow, what a great question. I feel like I want to throw just an initial comment out there, but then someone probably will answer this better. But surface catalysis, I think, is extremely important here. So never, in addition to any piezoelectric effect that could occur, I think that will definitely lower reaction barriers for interesting prebiotic synthesis. Anyone want to add to that? Bishal, unfortunately, I personally have not really studied piezoelectric effects on things like surface chemistry or chemistry in heterogeneous systems, so I don't think I can comment more on that. My general observation, though, would be that any kind of environmental stressor tends to supply energy, which is ultimately what you need. If you give enough energy, it doesn't even matter how reducing or not reducing the environment is, or if the system is catalytic, same thinking, that any added external stimulus is likely to lower kinetic barriers and improve chemical reactivity. All right, great. All right. There was a, let's see. Oh, Beth Ann has a question. How significantly could we expect an impact to increase the weathering of early Earth's crust, and how would it scale with impact size? For example, I would assume increased weathering both due to shock of the target near the crater and weathering of the ejecta. Would anyone like to take a stab at that?
I can take a first stab at it. The one thing that comes out of the impact process is the excavation and mixing of the upper layer, crust, and even mantle, depending on the impactor size. This material is then redistributed on the surface. There's going to be massive ejecta blankets, that could be kilometers thick, close to the rim of the original crater, and then tapering off. But that's to say that there is going to be lots and lots of material which is redistributed and made available for surface weathering. If by weathering you mean interaction with liquids at the surface, then we have access of possibly deep-seated material thrown into the surface, and that's interesting because of course it can drive interesting chemistry, right? So mantle composition could be then thrown at the surface, and so they behave different. Olivine or other things similar to that will behave differently than basaltic crust, and so there is a great potential for weathering of the crust of the earth as results of the input process. So in a sense, I suspect, and maybe we haven't looked at that, at least myself, closely, but I suspect that this has to be also an important part of the process of understanding what the conditions were.
Yvonne has written, what is a scale of an impact event that can lead to a climate state shift?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on what the climate state is. So clearly, for instance, Chicxulub were able to radically change the climate, in many different ways, and that's known by the geological record. Temperature could increase, could drop. First will drop because of the self-shading effect of the dust, and then on a longer term it might increase because of more CO2 into the atmosphere. So there are all sorts of processes like that. And other craters on Earth have been suggested that they have resulted in a significant shift into the climate. But if we're dealing with the Aegean, I would argue that we don't really know what the climate was in the first place, and so it's a little bit hard to make strong predictions of how that would have changed. But and depending on the size of the impact, but you can imagine something of the size of Chicxulub or larger that would likely had significant effect into the climate. So we're dealing with impact of larger than 10 kilometers at least, but maybe smaller ones will also have had an effect. I'm sure that other folks might have different thoughts here, so I would like to hear.
I mean, Simone, I largely agree with you. I also think, it depends on within the Hadean, the thickness of the background atmosphere. We could have had a pretty substantial CO2 atmosphere for some portion of the Hadean. If you look at like the Zoneley and Wogan models, looking at these early reducing impacts, sometimes some of their models, they start with 50 bars of CO2, some of them start with 2 bars of CO2, right? And in the first case, you need a larger impact to make the same degree of change to that atmosphere. So I think I agree with you. In the Hadean, we don't really know what the climate was, and so it's hard to quantify the effects there.
All right, thank you. Eduardo writes, what was the source of nitrogen in the atmosphere and when did it reach 70%? Good question.
That's a great question also. So nitrogen doesn't partition particularly well into solids or silicate liquids, and so a significant fraction of it might just have been directly vaporized straight into the atmosphere. Again, it's not a particularly reactive gas, so it depends on the composition of the impactors, right? Exactly how much was delivered. There are models that suggest we started off with more nitrogen than we have now, and that through impact erosion, we actually dropped in abundance over time. There's been some efforts at modeling nitrogen evolution over time on Earth. And these, of course, are strongly modified once biology starts up. But when did we get to 70%? That's a great question. I don't think we know the answer.
All right, thank you, Laura, for your answer. Tim, your hand is up. Tim, if you're speaking, we
Sorry,
can't
it's
hear
the
you.
dancing
Oh, there you are.
among the computers here. Sorry. Yeah, there's a great opportunity here, and this is a topic that follows from what Laura was just saying. It certainly is at least tangentially to this question, and it's covered in talks, etc. But this is a great opportunity to ask the experts, I think. And so there is this wave going on that you all know better than I do, following from the notion of early core formation and the two oxidizing upper portions of the Earth, about impact generated methane production. And there's a group of people that actually aren't very well represented here, but they love that, right? To get transient methane and do the things in the atmosphere that you need to do. And through conversations with Simone and others and reading the relevant papers, there's huge uncertainties in that. And it has to do with the nature of the impactor and how metallic it is. And even more so, the nature of the angle of impact, and whether it just ends up in the interior of the Earth or whether it's incorporated into outer portions where it can have those redox effects. And I wonder, I'm sure I'll put you on the spot, and I'm looking at different faces who are involved in this. How viable are those scenarios? What would it take to sustain methane at levels that could drive some of those prebiotic reactions? Could a series of impacts make it so that it's mostly methanic, or is it likely that ever happened from impacts? And yeah, ready to discuss.
Maybe I can give a quick stab at this, but I believe Laura already mentioned this, and she covered this in her talk. The work that, in terms of atmospheric chemistry, done by Kathleen, Nick Fogan, and others, and Kevin Zanni as well, in which they have looked at the production of methane in reactions into an atmosphere. So that will be one aspect, which is, there's a time scale, after an impact, depending on the size of the impacts, you can produce methane, and then it will last for some amount of time, depending on the size of the impact and how much methane is produced. So that kind of calculation has been done. Laura will know more on that than I do, so maybe she can add some comments. But I want to make also another comment, that is, there is a second way of producing methane, which is not in the atmospheric chemistry. In fact, it is in the subsurface. Now, too bad that Everett Schock is not here, because that is something they would have covered in his talk. So I would suggest folks interested in that to look at that, because that could be, depending on pressure, temperature, condition, adapt, just as a reaction, a fluid reacting with the chemistry, with the rocks, and under certain conditions, and maybe Nuri can talk about this actually, you can produce methane as well, which eventually will be made available in the subsurface, but most likely then out gas. And so we have these two components in which we can produce methane, both in the atmosphere directly and in the subsurface, which are widely different processes. And it's interesting to see how, in fact, in these two widely different processes could contribute in making methane, both in the atmosphere and subsurface. I think that's something that definitely deserves more investigation, but it's very fascinating.
All right, thank you. Vishal has written another question. How might the vapor plumes from high velocity impacts have facilitated the synthesis of complex organic molecules in early Earth's atmosphere? So this is somewhat related, maybe. And could similar processes be observed on icy moons or exoplanets with active impact histories, if I were to study about them? I want to take an initial stab at this. I think it's an important analogy is what you're saying, Vishal, which is essentially, you can think of an aqueous system impacting a planet, or the inverse is also true, meaning you have some sort of water containing surface, let's say the surface of an icy moon, and that's experiencing an impact. Either way, the thermodynamic conditions that are achieved, the whole thermodynamic path that induces chemistry, I think is the same in both cases. I think I'm not as sure about complex organic synthesis in the plume. I think in the condensed phase, definitely, I would say condensed phase chemistry would say that you get complex organic chemistry, but in sort of in a plume, so in sort of gas phase conditions where maybe you have very high temperatures but low pressures, the chemistry is very different. It's activated in a very different way. And so then it depends on a lot of things, like how much oxygen is there, for example, and what else, how dense the atmosphere might be, maybe secondarily. I think one thing I think about when I hear the question is carbon would prefer to be CO2 that has the lower heat of formation. But then these other things, maybe don't have such high heats of formation, and carbon can get kinetically trapped there.
In a lot of like modeling of impact vapor plume, and this goes for like the Zonale and Woga and stuff that's looking at very large impacts as well as really small impacts. I think a lot of the focus is largely on how do you make reactive nitrogen. So it's largely focused on production of things like HCN or HCC and those kinds of species, methane and ammonia also.
All right, thank you, Laura. Any other takers? If not, I'll go on to the next question. So Eduardo writes, I was always under the impression that the majority of impactors during the late heavy bombardment were small meteorites or small meteor sizes. Is this correct? And how would it affect the delivery of volatiles?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. Well, there's really two kinds of things we're talking about. The late heavy bombardment would have been what was previously proposed as a spike in the lunar crater record that was interpreted as a spike in the lunar cratering rate. And that would have been around 3.9 billion years ago. And then we've also been discussing late accretion, which is kind of separate from late heavy bombardment, but just represents the material delivered after the moon forming impact. And the amount of material delivered during late accretion is kind of constrained by this excess and highly stereophile elements within the Earth's mantle, and would have been much bigger than what was proposed as part of the late heavy bombardment, or what would have explained the spike in the lunar cratering record. However, I'd say the kind of consensus in the community has maybe moved a bit away from the late heavy bombardment having occurred at 3.9, and maybe that was a result of biases in the observations of the lunar cratering record and the dating of samples from that. So I think the consensus has kind of moved more towards just an impact flux that kind of declined monotonically in time and was just part of this tail end of accretion, or this late accretion of material that accreted on the Earth after the moon forming impact. And just based on the power law distribution of kind of projectile sizes, you'd expect most of the material to be concentrated in a few larger impactors, but then you would have many more smaller impactors. So you would have a mix of sizes, and the average size of the impactor would decrease over time.
Great, thank you for your answer. All right, let's see here. Eduardo asks, wouldn't have the lunar creation reset the volatile inventory on Earth? So I guess the lunar impact event.
Well, yeah, that's why we're kind of looking at this concentration of highly stereophile elements in the Earth's mantle to kind of see what the subsequent mass of material delivered is. The moon forming impact would have likely created a global magma ocean on the Earth. And so that would have kind of reset things, and the HSEs previously delivered would have gone to the Earth's core. And so it's after the mantle reached its solid state that you can kind of track the delivery of excess material. Yeah.
Right. Let's see. First, I think there are a couple of comments I should read, except for now the chat's gone all over the place. So Nuri, I believe you wrote this next. Adding to what Simone said about the methane production from water rock interactions, my results show that most of the water rock systems at certain temperatures of post-impact sites can produce abundant hydrogen. Everett shows that methane is more favored than CO2 at that temperature range. Neat. So impacts provide a suitable environment for methane production. Great. Then it looks like Stephen might have written an answer to Bishal's question. He wrote, detectability for such signatures for exoplanets will require an ejecta presence in the upper atmosphere where the opacity allows for transmission spectroscopy. An alternative would be large enough impacts that result in a trailing gas signature for the planet. So I guess the planet could also be detected via spectroscopy during or after a planetary transit. All right, thank you, Stephen. All right, do we have any other questions, either in the chat or maybe through unmuting or raising your hand? Okay, going once, going twice. I'm going to say then I think we're ready for some closing statements. So Tim and Karen, would you guys like to say anything as we wrap up?
Karen, I also think that we probably shouldn't have the last word. Eve, I think that's probably should be you. But I will just add thanks to everyone for making this really extraordinary. And I will tell you from our first workshop that the archiving of the talks, which we did on YouTube, became the greatest resource of all. And that those talks have had something between 20 and 30,000 hits now. And so they will live on in perpetuity. And we will also distill down all the things we've been recording from these conversations to the comments, various other things, and somehow make these things accessible. But when we first thought about what one of these things could be, this is exactly what we were hoping for. So thank you for that. And we hope that it'll be one in a series where we can do multiple of these over a year. And the idea is that they'll become easier and easier. And even Nir and Simone will relate to that. Now that we have a template, we can just sort of hand it off and say plug in. And there will be one happening soon on RNA worlds, the sort of a quo vadis on that field. And so maybe Karen wants to say a few words and we can let maybe Eve close.
Yeah, I really just want to emphasize what Tim said. We hatched this plan a long time ago with this dream in our head. And thanks to all of you and the speakers, and particularly the organizing committee, which is Nir, Eve, and Simone, like the dream came true and a little better. So this has really been spectacular. I don't know that I've been more satisfied with having some crazy idea turn into something real. So I want to thank all of you for that. And I do want Eve to close, but I want to cycle through the whole organizing group. So I'm going to throw it to Simone and Nir, and then we'll end with Eve, if that's okay.
That sounds good. I would like to thank you guys for suggesting, and by you, I mean those involved with the TIPCEEE, Karen and team mostly for this one workshop, and to come after us and suggesting this as an interesting topic. And what was interesting to me is I have all these different expertise coming together and trying to make the point of what we know today about the roles of impacts on the early Earth. Some of us, that's what we do every single day, but not all of us. And there is so many different things going on. And so it's just nice that we put everything together. And I want to thank all the speakers for the hard work and the time that they put in making the talks that Tim said they will remain available online forever. And so this will be a resource moving forward. And hopefully, I would think that a workshop like this would be a starting point for maybe new collaborations, new idea, new directions of research. So thank you so much for organizing all this.
I guess I'll go next. I also, first I want to thank Teresa Kane for her outstanding organizational skills. So I don't know if she's online. I tried to see, but definitely she was the glue that held everything together. So I'm very grateful.
She hears you.
Oh, good. It was impressive, particularly given the difficulty in juggling so many schedules all over the country. So thank you so much. I loved this workshop. It was so much fun. The talks were uniformly great. Almost all were outside of my area of expertise, and yet I found all of them accessible and very enjoyable. So thank you all, and thank you to Tim and Karen. It was just a really great experience. I'm hopeful this can also act as a proposal incubator, and I and others can strike up collaborations. Thank you all.
I'll just say a general thanks to everyone. This doesn't work unless everyone participates, and we're really grateful for all the help. And what I hope everyone who's still online takes away from this is at least one new idea, one new place that they can look, one new person that they can reach out to and say, hey, I don't know if our research intersects, but let's find out if it does, and let's figure out how to capitalize on that. And on a personal note, all y'all who study impact creators, Oz, I'm looking at you. I am really good at toting and lugging supplies, and I'm a quick learner. So if you need somebody in the field, I'd love to collaborate on something like that. So you might be hearing from me. But also on a more serious ending, please do think about what you've heard. Take the opportunity to reach out to someone new, because great science only happens when we all work together. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And with that, I give you back 4 minutes of your life, and I hope to see you at another PCE3 or TIPCEEE event sometime soon. Take care, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.